The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you to everyone who's joined us for our final webinar of the year. We have more people joining by the second, so as per usual, we'll just give people a couple more minutes before beginning with today's presentation. Thank you. Again, thank you to everyone who is on the line for today's webinar. We will give remaining joiners another 30 to 60 seconds to join the session, and then we will make a start. So welcome everyone to today's webinar from Insignia. This is our sixth and final webinar for 2017, and it looks like it's going to be the most heavily attended session of the year. So I'm delighted that the onrush of Christmas, and if you're in the UK, the inclement weather hasn't stopped you from continuing to focus on crisis management matters. For those of you who might be joining one of these sessions for the first time, my name is Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Managing Director of Insignia. We are a crisis management training, planning and exercising consultancy. We help organisations to do and say the right things on the worst days of their organisational lives. And I guess today's webinar is really about a number of organisations that have had some of those worst days of their lives, but crucially, it's about what we can learn from those incidents. It is not, categorically not, about finger pointing or being wise after the event. Having been involved in many crises over the years, it's always easier managing a crisis when you're outside of the situation or after it's happened. It's much more challenging when you're in the heat of it, in the bubble, trying to protect your reputation and protect your organization. So, as I say, the purpose of today's session is not to pick apart or criticize those that have suffered incidents and issues in 2017, but instead to aim to learn from them to help us plan and consider how we might better protect our organizations next year, and also to give you a little bit of insight from our perspective as to what we perceive some of the key crisis management trends in 2018 being. So I'm going to start off with a couple of quotes. Given that Brexit is one of the crises that we've been grappling with during 2017 and will undoubtedly be so in 2018 too. I thought it might be nice to have a look at a couple of quotes from historical European leaders around crisis and how to learn from it. So, first of all, from Otto von Bismarck, his quote is, "Only a fool learns from his own mistakes. The wise man learns from the mistakes of others." Far be it for me to challenge the Chancellor of Germany, but I would agree with the second half of that quote. But actually, successful crisis management and crisis planning is both by learning from the mistakes of others, but also from your own mistakes. Today, we're going to primarily look at the incidents and issues which affected other organisations, but I would always advise you to take the learnings from near misses, real incidents, issues and crises that your organisation face, and make sure that you act upon those. Secondly, of course, Winston Churchill. Let's try and move that. Oops, sorry. Winston Churchill, a quote from the British wartime leader, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." And that's what this afternoon is really about. Given that a number of organisations have been through the turbulent times presented by a crisis, it's incumbent upon us to, at the very least, learn from those experiences and hopefully enhance our own crisis resilience. So we're going to look at the magnificent or not so magnificent 7 crises today across a range of sectors, countries and different crisis types. And unusually for these sessions, if you have comments or questions during the presentation, particularly other observations on a particular incident, please feel free to feed those in, and I will ask my colleague Catherine Timms to flag those up to me as we go. So if there are comments, observations that you have about these particular crises and more importantly learnings from them, please do input them as we go through. So first of all, I wanted to look at the crisis which affected Whirlpool, the manufacturer of home appliances, and in particular fires that have been breaking out as a result of tumble dryers overheating and catching fire. And this has been happening over the last 2 or 3 years. 2 people at least have died as a direct result of these fires. And over the last 3 years, Whirlpool has been responding to that situation. The challenge that they're facing is that they are not getting ahead of the situation. They are being pressed by MPs, the media, which the Consumers Association has a campaign which is fundamentally saying, Whirlpool, you're not doing enough, you're not doing it quick enough, you are not taking your responsibilities seriously enough. What can we learn from this? Well, I would encourage you, whatever your organisation does, as an absolute minimum, to plan, train and rehearse for your priority risks. What do I mean by that? Well, it shouldn't and mustn't be a surprise for a manufacturer of home appliances that one day they may have a fault with those appliances and they need to organise a product recall. So whatever your business, whether you run hotels, in which case you might need to plan, unfortunately, for terrorist incidents, whether you're a cruise line, in which case you know that the norovirus is a possibility, or whether you're a financial services company, in which case a data breach is a possibility. Whatever your most likely risks are, it is critical that you are able to respond to those most likely risks in an effective, professional, and appropriate manner. So get the basics right, fundamentally. if a situation emerges, a crisis or an issue of any kind, always try to lead the response. Don't just react to it. In this situation, it appears that Whirlpool has been constantly reacting to pressure and the comments and questions of third parties like MPs, the media, and the Consumer Association, and it's never quite been able to get ahead of the situation. Get the pain over with quickly. This is a situation which has been evolving over several years now. Try to take quick and decisive action in the early stages to nip the situation in the bud. Otherwise, you do end up chasing the situation, constantly reacting to it, rather than driving the narrative and rather than proactively shaping perceptions of your organization. How do you do that? Well, do that by exceeding stakeholder expectations. Good crisis management is like many other things in life. Stakeholders will have expectations. If you can at least meet, but ideally exceed those expectations in your response, then you will take a lot of the sting out of the situation. So exceed expectations in your response if possible. I'm going to try and remove, I know you can see my control panel, so I'm going to try and remove that. There we go, that's taken that off the screen. Okay, so exceed stakeholder expectations. Critically, align actions with words. It's not good enough just to trot out the usual crisis communication messages of, we're aware of what's happening, we're concerned about what's happening, and we're taking issue to address it. Those are the right messages, but you have to be able to substantiate those messages with action. So in your crisis communication and crisis management response, make sure that you are not just communicating words and good messages, but that you are taking actions which substantiate those messages. And a final point, and we get asked about this quite a lot when we're running exercises. One of the things that Whirlpool has been criticised for was for fielding their PR and marketing guy as the person who faced the House of Commons Select inquiry into this issue. That was perceived as the organisation not taking the situation seriously enough. So if you are faced with a major issue, particularly one where there has been serious harm on people, in this case fatalities, you need to put someone from the business forward, not just the PR guy. So that really is the lessons from that particular situation that affected Whirlpool. I would summarize it as get the basics right. Okay. So moving on to the second situation. Bell Pottinger. As you will no doubt be aware, Bell Pottinger was one of the world's leading PR consultancies, and as I'm sure most of you are aware, Bell Pottinger is now in administration as a result of its relationship and its advice to the Gupta family in South Africa, which was perceived to have been stoking up racial tension. What are the learnings that we can take from the demise of Bell Pottinger? Well, we are seeing a significant trend, which is that corporate behaviour and ethics are presenting an increasing risk to reputation, and you need to plan accordingly. How you operate, what you do, your values, your ethics, your integrity, they are now very much at the heart of your risk landscape, and you need to be sure that those softer risks form part of your crisis management planning, not just the harder risks of events and incidents. Secondly, be very aware that crises which strike at the heart of who you are or what you do are the most damaging of all. Bell Pottinger was an organization which was responsible for building and managing reputations. Therefore, a crisis type which actually seemed to imply that they were not capable of managing their own reputation was particularly damaging. So with your own organization, think about the kinds of crises that could actually cut to the essence of what you are, what you do, or what you stand for. Because if you ever face a situation which challenges those things, they are the kinds of situations which could cause potentially catastrophic harm to the organization. Planning, rehearsing and exercising and training are of course all important in crisis management, but to prevent a crisis of this type requires something more than that. It requires a crisis-resistant culture. What do I mean by a crisis-resistant culture? Well, I mean one in which anybody can raise a flag if they have concerns about behaviours within the organisation which perhaps are sailing a little close to the wind or which are in contravention to the values of the organisation. So a crisis-resistant culture is willing for people to, in fact, encouraging for people to whistleblow if they have concerns. It also requires a leadership team which is prepared to listen to those concerns, listen and act. And it requires an organisation which values long-term doing the right thing above short-term making a quick buck. Therefore, senior leadership will be crucial in both preventing and responding to crises of this type, those that cut across integrity and ethics. And I guess what the Bell Pottinger situation reminds us is that in the worst possible case, a serious crisis which does cut across everything that your organisation is about has the potential to destroy it within weeks. So be on your guard. The third situation was really the combination of a technological issue which caused then serious operational issues, and in which the communication could have been improved to have helped remediate those technical and operational issues. It's the system outage that BA suffered in May and June, which caused over 800 flights to be cancelled, and it's alleged more than £50 million in compensation to be paid. You'll recall these scenes at Heathrow and Gatwick, and the complaints of passengers that they simply were not getting the information that they required. What can we learn from this situation? Well, plan and train for the worst case scenario. This was a monumental outage with a massive impact on the organisation. One could say bigger than BA could have anticipated. But our advice would be plan and train for that worst case, worse than you can possibly conceive, because if you've genuinely planned and trained for the worst case, anything better than that, hopefully, is going to be relatively straightforward to resolve. I was at a conference in the early part of this year when there was a speech from the head of communications of an organisation that had had a catastrophic incident affect their business. His advice to the audience was, do you know what? We had rehearsed, we had trained beforehand, but we'd never really countenanced that something quite this bad could happen. And so our exercises had kind of covered the bad, but not really bad incidents that we could face. He said they are now planning, at least in some of their exercises, for a catastrophic incident rather than just a run-of-the-mill incident. So go to your worst place and plan and train for it. I guess the other thing I would encourage you to do is learn from any near misses within your own organisation. This wasn't the first system problem that BA had suffered, and it's important if you have near misses, whatever type of organisation that you're involved in, don't ignore those near misses. Take the learnings from them. Take actions to prevent them happening again. Run scenario planning sessions to walk through what if this situation hadn't been a near miss, but a real incident. So learn from near misses. Reputation and business protection requires an effective operational and communication response. Understandably, it took BA a couple of days to finally resolve the problem, and it took them quite a while to get into gear with their communication response. The big message here, though, is you need to be geared up to be doing both of these things effectively and quickly. It's not enough simply to solve the problem if the communication is inadequate. Equally, it's not enough to communicate brilliantly if you can't solve the technical problem itself. So make sure that your crisis management planning, training and exercising covers both elements, and in a real situation you execute both sides of the coin in parallel in order to protect your reputation. Fill the communication vacuum. It's a very old piece of crisis communication theory, but it is so important. When there is a crisis, people will be hungry, ravenous for information, and it will almost always be in your best interests to get as much information out as quickly as possible. Otherwise, in a major incident, stakeholders will get frustrated. The media in particular will go to other sources of information, sources which will likely not have your best interests at heart. There was also issues with getting information to customers and passengers in this situation, with problems with phone lines being jammed, problems with information at the airports being in short supply, problems with not enough information being on the website, and criticism for a lack of spokespeople being put forward to the media. Think about your own organisation. Think about the people with whom you might need to communicate during a crisis. Plan it out in advance. Who might we need to talk to? Who are our stakeholders? How would we talk with them? What are our potential channels? And what would we say to them? And have that pinned down in principle ahead of time, rather than trying to work it out under pressure during a major incident. And critical to that, and one specific point that is often overlooked, is make sure that you have sufficient frontliners who have the skills, the information, and the permission to communicate. When you've got, in this situation, thousands of passengers trapped within an airport, clearly the first people they're going to turn to are people in BA uniforms at the airport. I'd encourage you to think about, who would your front line be? You know, if you're a retailer, it'll be your shop assistants. For other organisations, it might be your call centre. It might be your security guards. It might be your switchboard operator. But who would people turn to get information in a crisis affecting your organisation, and make sure that those people are trained, briefed, and are given the permission to communicate if a situation breaks. Again, do let me know as we go through this if you have your own observations, comments, questions, or indeed any disagreements with any of the insights which we're taking out of this year's crises. Grenfell Tower, one of the, well, I would say the most harrowing crisis of 2017, which, as we now know, resulted in the deaths of 71 people. Now, one could run a whole day analysing the learnings and the implications of Grenfell Tower, and clearly the inquiry is continuing as we speak. So I didn't want to dissect this in great detail. I really wanted to share 2 or 3 principles which I think are real reminders to us as a result of Grenfell Tower, and then one very practical thing. Before doing so, though, I wanted to remind you, for those of you who've been on previous calls, of the work that Oxford Metrica did around looking at what are the characteristics of a successful communication response to a crisis. And they drew out these 4 factors as being criteria which are likely to predict reputation protection in the aftermath of a crisis. Disclose promptly. Get news out quickly. Get information out quickly. Demonstrate candor and transparency in disclosure. Be open and honest in what you say. Take responsibility for your actions or those of your agents, and demonstrate credible follow-up behaviours. Take actions which demonstrably address the issues that have arisen. And I would suggest that many of the parties involved in the Grenfell Tower incident, and obviously the councils took a lot of the heat in this situation, probably could have done a better job of ticking the boxes on this list of predictors of reputation protection. So let me now draw out those couple of principles and one practical thought that I think might assist your thinking in crisis management planning and response next year. What I think is very clearly shown again by Grenfell Tower is that a legalistic response is counterproductive in the face of a human tragedy. We all understand the legal issues, we all understand the importance of legal advice, and we all understand potential legal ramifications. But time and time over the years, we have seen that organisations which try to use the law in response to a major breaking human crisis do enormous damage to themselves. And so when the leader of Kensington and Chelsea Council refused to allow the media into a public meeting for legal reasons, that was one of the tipping points and certainly one of the ratchets that did even more harm to the organisation and was probably the tipping point for his resignation. So we've seen this over the years. Do not ignore your lawyers, but if you overdo the legal response, particularly when there's been a human tragedy, it is likely to do you far more harm than good. Secondly, as we've heard from Oxford Metrica, crisis communication, effective crisis communication, is based on openness, transparency, and accountability, and a willingness to listen. I think there was a high degree of defensiveness, passing the buck, and hiding away with some of the communication around Grenfell Tower. Again, it will do you no service adopting that approach should you be affected by a major issue. And then the practical point, in all crises, but particularly in one of this nature, there is not going to be a single organisation, you, responding to it. So when you think about some of your priority risks and some of the situations which may affect you, think also about who are the third parties, the other partner organisations or those who have a stake in the situation who may also be involved in such a situation. Identify them, build understanding of how they would operate, and ideally develop relationships beforehand. I guess one of the most obvious examples of this would be the emergency services. You know, if you are involved in a major incident, fire, police, and ambulance are very likely going to be involved. So take time to understand how they manage a crisis. Take time to understand how they communicate in a crisis, and make sure that you have their contact details available. If anyone's particularly interested in the emergency services angle, I'd encourage you to download the report from our website, where we had Amanda Coleman from who heads communications at Greater Manchester Police, and Paul Breed, ex-police superintendent from North Wales Police, who gave us their advice on how to work with the emergency services in a crisis. So if that is of interest, I'd encourage you to download that report. We do have a comment here from Michelle, who says, in a situation like Grenfell Tower, it's imperative that the right person is put forward to speak. If you come across in a way which is not empathetic, you are not the right person to speak. PR advisors have to be brave in this situation. Yeah, I would totally concur with that. It is crucial, clearly, to be a warm and genuinely caring human being when communicating about these situations, and you need someone within the organisation who exemplifies those qualities. And again, to Michelle's point, it's up to the chief executive's advisors to make sure that they are able to display those qualities, or consider putting forward an alternative spokesperson instead, but not the PR person, as we mentioned previously. Okay, here's another one from the summer. You will recall the deplaning from United Airlines, which went viral due to the videos and the photos that were posted, and costed United, well, a week in the media and social media spotlight, and also a fair amount in terms of management time and the financial cost of this situation. What are some of the learnings that we can take out of that? Well, first one I would say is prepare for the unexpected. What do I mean by that? Well, if you recall the first situation that we talked about, the Whirlpool tumble dryer recall, that was all about preparing for the expected. And I would recommend you have playbooks for your top 5 to 10 most likely risks. However, you also need to be nimble and flexible enough, and your crisis management plans need to be sufficiently broad-reaching that they can help to guide you through an unexpected event. So playbooks against key risks, yes, but not to the exclusion of general principles and processes to deal with the unexpected crisis. Why was this unexpected? Well, I would say that the airlines are generally world-class in terms of their response to a physical crisis event. Most dramatically, that would be the case in a plane crash. You know, they rehearse for this. A lot of the principles for crisis management come from the airline industry. So I'm sure that if United had had a plane go down, they would have actually responded very well. They did not respond as well as they would have liked to this unconventional crisis. The second learning is you must align your planning and response with the reality of social media. What do we mean by that? Well, in terms of your planning, you need to expect that your crisis will go viral and will go around the world, potentially within a matter of minutes. And therefore, your response, both in terms of its speed and how and what you communicate, needs to align with the power, speed, and pace of that social media reality. The power of pictures. A lot of people think about social media and think about what people are saying on social media. What's really powerful is the images that are appearing on social media. And, a lot of those images of breaking events, incidents, they are creating impact very, very quickly. They're being used by the conventional media. So you need to be aware that it's not just words that will be appearing, but often images as well. What does that mean in terms of your communication? Well, it must be timely. It must be quick. If you're not communicating, for hours and hours and hours after an event has been broadcast around the world, there is no way that you will be influencing the narrative. Secondly, the response must be empathetic. If you remember in the United incident, the first statement took a long time to come out, and then actually it was quite a cold, critical, defensive line that was sent out. Really, you want to avoid being slow, defensive, or cold. Ideally, in a situation like this, you need to be quick. You need to communicate empathy, as Michelle was talking about in the previous example, and you need to be coming across as warm and caring. So beware the slow and cold and corporate response in your communication. Cybercrime. There have been another raft of cyber incidents during 2017. One of the largest being the Equifax data breach. And I'd just like to take some of the broader learnings and therefore the implications for planning out of Equifax and a number of the other data breaches. And the first one is this really. It's not a question of if, but when you will suffer a cyber incident. Plan accordingly. So we know that there have been more cyber incidents this year than ever before, and I'd be willing to bet a lot of money there'll be even more next year. So you have to gear up accordingly. As always, the cover-up is worse than the crisis, and we're going to talk about Uber shortly, but we know that it was revealed that they had a major cyber incident 12 to 18 months ago, but that was only revealed about 12 to 18 months after the event. And it was that cover-up or lack of communication, let's say, that was criticised more than the incident itself. So beware not communicating, beware holding back in communicating, and make sure that your response, if at all possible, is pitch perfect. How do you do that? Well, critically, ahead of time, align your IT, legal, and communications colleagues. These are the three most critical functions within the business when you have a cyber incident. And I think it's really important that those three areas are talking and planning and building relationships ahead of an incident, again, to avoid challenging conversations and decisions and plans being developed during the situation itself. So I'd really encourage you to get those three areas, planning and thinking as a coordinated triumvirate, rather than trying to get that to happen at the time. Conduct scenario planning. That's one of the things that I think they and you should be doing ahead of time. And then, good old best practice, create an incident response plan. Who are the stakeholders with whom you might need to communicate? What are the messages in principle that you will need to communicate? Develop template materials, develop in advance template holding statements, have a dark site ready with information for people to go to. One of the things that Equifax was criticised for was that whilst they put a website up there, actually it wasn't as effective or provide the information that would have been expected. So think about that and prepare it beforehand. And again, consider what would be our communication channels. Rehearse, run some cyber exercises, whether it's a desktop or whether it's a full simulation, to rehearse your response. If it's a question of not if, but when, then you need to have rehearsed your response rather than be rehearsing it when everything is at stake. Per one of the previous examples, exceed expectations in your response. Again, in the Equifax situation, you may recall that they offered credit insurance for anybody that signed up to their website. But if you did sign up for that credit insurance, you would then automatically waive your rights to take part in the class action against Equifax. That was not felt to be exceeding customer expectations. And then the final point is, whatever your crisis, for all the planning, training and exercising, you need to execute that response really, really well. And I mentioned there were issues with Equifax's website. They also received criticism for their CEO video. Great that the CEO made a statement, great use of a video to actually, get the person across, but because of some of the language used and because he was so clearly using auto cue, the execution of what was a very good idea didn't quite live up to expectations. So don't just have a good plan and good thinking, it needs to be executed supremely well as well. As we moved into the final quarter of the year, of course, we had this explosion of sexual harassment and inappropriate behaviour, which washed through Hollywood and showbiz more generally, and then moved to the political world. And, that has been one of the big news stories of the last quarter, and I suspect will continue to be for quite a while into the future. What are the learnings from that? Well, ethical and behavioural crises have the power to do more damage than events and incidents. Touched on this earlier with the Bell Pottinger situation. The Bell Pottinger was really about corporate behaviour. This is about personal behaviour of powerful people. But in your organisations, ethical and behavioural crises may do or will do more damage than a simple event or incident. Therefore, your reputational risk assessments and your crisis management planning need to cover these people risks, not just events, accidents, incidents. You need to consider what are the people risks within our organisation as well. That's why HR should definitely be involved in your crisis management planning. So if they're not involved, I would encourage you to involve them in that process. It's really also about instilling a crisis-resistant culture, which again we talked about earlier, but crises that involve people and behaviour, the best way of preventing issues of that kind is by instilling a crisis-resistant culture within the business, and where people are encouraged to challenge those in power if they spot behaviours and activities which contravene what is acceptable or what the organisation stands for. And finally, be alert to a changing external context and its implications for your vulnerability to risk. I want to explain that and draw two broad points out of that. First point is, what might have been acceptable 25 years ago may very well not be acceptable now. So check that the behaviours within your organisation or the ways of doing business that may have been absolutely fine 25 years ago are still in keeping with what people would expect today. The second and slightly different point is sexual harassment is one of the biggest issues of the moment right now. So the media are looking for further incidents of this kind. More and more people are coming forward. So be aware that because of that, your vulnerability to this kind of situation is greater now than it ever was. It's a general point as well. As the spotlight goes on to certain different topics and issues, you need to be very vigilant about your vulnerability to that particular issue which is in that spotlight at that particular time. So I'm going to come on to the final crisis now before going into some things to think about as we look at 2018. And it's Uber. Uber really has had a year in which it has faced challenge after challenge, from sexual harassment through to lack of thorough driver background checks, through to controversy around its license to operate in London, criticism over pricing in the event of terrorist attacks, leadership scandals and changes, and as I mentioned earlier, a major cyber attack. And I just wanted to draw some general learnings out of what has been a very turbulent year for Uber and what that might mean for you. I thought the BBC summarised the year that Uber has had very aptly by saying managing Uber appears to be like a game of whack-a-mole. No sooner has one crisis been dealt with when another one rears its ugly head. What can we learn? Again, culture and leadership are critical. If you really want to prevent and or respond to crises in a really effective manner, it requires leadership from the very top of an organisation that creates the right culture and then makes the right decisions when the worst happens. I think, interestingly, I know a number of you on the line are from what I would describe as challenger brands. I think there's maybe an assumption that because Uber was a bit of an upstart and was shaking up a market, that really they didn't need to worry too much about reputation. I don't think that's the case anymore, and actually we'll see a quote from their CEO in a minute, which would rather endorse that view. Beware the give a dog a bad name syndrome. At all costs, if you have a crisis or have to deal with a major issue or incident, please try to avoid having a second or third crisis or issue. If you have a crisis, it will put you in the spotlight, not least the media spotlight, and the media and all stakeholders will be looking closely at you for a repeat, which is why it's so important to learn and act on what you encounter during a crisis. But what will happen if you don't do that is you will keep popping into that spotlight. So do everything you can to resolve the first crisis quickly and effectively, and to take steps to avoid any repetition. And the final point is issues and crises of this magnitude, and certainly when they're repeated, do have a real impact on business performance. And here's that quote from Uber's CEO. The truth is that there is a high cost to a bad reputation. It really matters what people think of us. Going forward, it's critical that we act with integrity in everything we do. That doesn't mean abandoning our principles, but rather building trust through our actions and our behaviour. So, moving on to trends, priorities and advice for 2018. 5 things to think about as you begin planning for how you are going to prevent and respond to crises next year. Firstly, continued economic and political turbulence will create greater uncertainty and challenge organisations to be well organised yet nimble and flexible in their crisis response. The world is a very uncertain and turbulent place at the moment when you think about the Brexit uncertainties and the unpredictable behaviour of the President of the United States. It is clear that 2018 is going to have significant uncertainty and turbulence attached to it, and that unexpected risks will occur. What does that mean? What I suggest it means is you need to have a well-conceived, well-rehearsed crisis management plan and approach in place. But because the world is so uncertain, you also as an organisation need to be nimble and flexible enough to respond effectively to unexpected events. So have the plan, but also create an organisation which is agile, nimble and flexible in terms of responding to the unexpected. Many of 2018's most damaging crises will centre on organisational behaviour, ethics and integrity. We covered this, touched on this when thinking about Bell Pottinger. We don't see this changing next year. Indeed, we think that ethics, integrity and organisational behaviour will be even more in the forefront next year. Therefore, make sure that planning and rehearsing for those people-based risks forms part of your thinking. Personal behaviours of business leaders will come under scrutiny, impacting the reputations of the businesses they run. So we saw in the section with Harvey Weinstein that scandals around personal inappropriate behaviour has gone like a wildfire through showbiz and through politics. We anticipate that that will be coming to businesses soon, and the personal behaviours of business leaders will come under the spotlight. So again, it is about being prepared to respond to those human crises, not just the events and incidents. Thinking about cyber attacks, we've said they are going to continue next year. Not only are they going to continue, they are likely to increase. And therefore, because I won't say cyber attacks are going to be an everyday occurrence, and that no one will care that a breach has occurred, but people will be actually paying more attention to how you respond to a breach rather than the fact of the breach itself. So that's the area to focus on. Yes, try and stop it, but knowing that they're increasing, be absolutely geared up to respond effectively should the worst happen. Sadly, we can also expect further acts of terrorism next year. Let's hope not, but we know that the emergency services and the intelligence services are preventing attacks all of the time, and unfortunately it only needs one terrorist to get through for another incident to occur. So particularly if you are a public-facing organisation in the front line, the pressure will be on you to respond with professionalism, competence and compassion. If there is any chance that your organisation could be in the front line of a terrorist incident, do think, scenario plan how you would respond to that. Think about those relationships that you might need with the emergency services and other first responders, and map out exactly what we would do should the worst happen to us. So those are our thoughts on trends, priorities, and advice for next year. In the final 5 minutes of this webinar, I just wanted to thank you for joining this and the previous webinars this year, and just give you a bit of advance notice of a couple of things that we're planning for next year. The first is a live exercise at the Churchill War Rooms on the 6th of March. Now, a number of you I know who are on this webinar joined us for our first live exercise back in September, when we ran a free cyber exercise for people from a whole range of different organisations to participate in, and 50 of you did so, and we've had fantastic feedback on that event, so thank you for that. And as a consequence, we are running another live exercise on the 6th of March. And what I'd like to do now is actually get your views on what you would like the exercise scenario to do. And I am stretching my technological powers now, and forgive me if you can see my control panel when I do this, but I'd like you to vote for which of the these three topics you would find of most interest and value in an exercise. Number one is a repeat of a cyber exercise. Number two is taking the personal behaviours and inappropriate behaviours that we've been seeing in Hollywood and politics and applying that to a corporate situation. And the third one is a terrorist themed exercise. So I'm going to try and post a poll now, and assuming you receive it on your screens, please can you let me know which of those you would find of most interest and value. So I'm hoping that you are now receiving that poll, and I can see you are, because I can see that people are voting. I'll just give you a minute or two to complete that. Excellent. And as you can see, you can vote across multiple topics, because we may well run more than one of these sessions next year. So I will just leave that to flow through. It seems there's significant interest in all of those areas. So keep voting whilst we summarise. But thank you for that. I'm going to leave that open. And then finally, to say we will have our first webinar of next year on the 31st of January, right at the end of the month. Topic to be confirmed, but if you'd like to put that in your calendars, please do. Finally, thank you for joining us today. And let me just share that. I'm going to finish the poll. Okay, so yeah, 31st of January for our next webinar, but thank you for joining this session. Thank you for joining us in previous webinars, and thank you also those of you that attended the live exercise at the War Rooms. If there is anything that we can help you with, or any questions arising out of this session, please do contact me. Otherwise, have a very safe and peaceful Christmas. Make sure that you prioritise your crisis management planning as you think towards 2018, and we very much look forward to talking with you again next year. Thank you very much.